Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. If you're a regular Politics Guys listener, you probably noticed that we've changed our introduction. We thought it would be nice to freshen things up with a low-key intro that conveys the cool, calm, and collected way we try to approach politics. Also, our old intro, which featured Il Papa Giraffe doing Love the Government, a song I really like, resulted in a number of comments from people who thought they weren't saying love, but, well, something we can't say without violating our non-explicit language designation on iTunes. The new music is a song called Low Pressure by Ash Turner. We hope you like it. Also, I wanted to remind you about the Politics Guys contest I announced last week, where one lucky winner, chosen at random, will get a $15 Amazon gift card. To enter, all you have to do is review the show on iTunes or retweet our new show tweets or share our new show posts on Facebook. To increase your chances, you can do all of that if you want. We'll announce the winner on our show next week. Good luck. Joined today by my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican strategist, Jay Carson. We start today on a different note with a story we won't be talking about. Now, as I'm sure you know, there were some developments, or rather additional leaks, in the ongoing Trump-Russia investigation, and I've been a strong supporter of investigations from the beginning, and I actually cheered the appointment of Robert Mueller as a special counsel, but these sort of snippets of out-of-context, questionably sourced leaks, I don't think they tell us anything. I feel like they're mostly sensationalist scandal bait that, of course the media covers them because, sensationalist scandal bait is what sells, but also, at least to some extent, and this, it pains me to say this, the Trump camp is right, at least in part, in saying that the media, or at least certain parts of it, are in fact out to get him. Now, whether or not that's justified or not is another issue, and I think you can make a case that it is, but maybe that's a special episode of the media and Donald Trump we might want to consider doing. But the point is I believe these sort of pseudo-news stories get in the way of the sort of coverage of substantial, substantive policy issues, the sort of things that, we started the Politics Guys to cover. So, Jay, what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, I think, I agree absolutely. And we've said this a couple times throughout doing the Trump scandal stories is, we don't know, what we don't know. And there's really nothing, if there is a leak that says that Kushner was talking to the Russians, well, it beats me. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. There's not much you or I can add to that conversation at this point. Once you get to a position where there are actual findings from either a congressional committee, from an FBI, from the special counsel, or someone like that, where there's a report and sort of established facts, and you can talk about here's where things go from there. Then I think it's worth talking about. But otherwise, it does tend to suck up all the oxygen out of the room. Just doing the week by week of here's something else that might have happened or might not have happened.
Right. Yeah, and that's not to say that we're all of a sudden, in the bag for Trump or pro-Trump, or we don't think that there are some, troubling aspects to these allegations, but we're just waiting for the real official investigation as opposed to reporting the leak of the week. All right, so our top story that we're actually going to talk about is President Trump's first international trip. Now, last week, Trey and I talked about the first leg of the trip, and that was the president's visit to Saudi Arabia. Of course, after leaving there, he went to Israel, Vatican City to meet with the Pope, some of the G7 countries, and a NATO meeting, and then he capped off the trip with a visit to American troops before heading home. So, Jay, what to you stands out about the trip, and what, if anything, do you feel that the president accomplished?
I think it was terrific. It was a terrific trip. No, I think it was good. And again, this has been sort of a surprise with Trump, is that we sort of expected him to be stronger on domestic and then just sort of floundering in foreign policy. And you can agree with or disagree with what he was doing on these trips. But I think he was taking some strong positions, firming up our alliances in the Middle East with countries like Saudi Arabia. And again, you can say the Saudis are not perhaps the ideal ally. Would we rather have someone else? Yes, but we don't live in a perfect world, and you have to sort of take they are we're better off dealing with them than the Iranians, the Syrians, and so forth. So I think he's doing the right thing, and the fact that he's meeting with the Israelis, and again he's been sort of non-committal as far as he's been Israel's best friend, but also said he doesn't want to see new settlements. So I think that went well, and also there's the political point, and people have raised this rightly so, that when you're in trouble domestically, sometimes it's a good thing to do something internationally, just because it makes you look more presidential, and even for Donald Trump,
Right.
Again, although holding his hand on the goofy glowing globe thing with like the Legion of Doom seemed pretty weird. But otherwise, no, I think that went well.
Before we move on to the other countries, I did want to sort of discuss the human rights thing with you a little bit, because, I think you can make a reasonable case that maybe President Obama lectured too much, some would even say hectored too much about the human rights issue. But it seems to me that in so many...
He was all over the Cubans on that. But go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that in so many ways, Donald Trump is not just a reaction, but an overreaction to some of what you could possibly argue were the excesses or errors or overcorrections of President Obama. Because I think it's certainly true that we can't change Saudi Arabia's human rights, their policies, right? But I think also we shouldn't just, there is something to be said for that whole idea of us as an example to the world, and as was President Reagan, right, put it, the shining the city on the hill kind of thing. And
shining city on a hill, yeah.
And I think we do have, a sort of a moral responsibility. And so sure, while we shouldn't hector other countries, I think it's entirely reasonable to say, hey, we have a problem with how you treat women, with how you treat dissidents. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to try to work constructively with you, but know that this is a real serious problem for us, and is going to be a problem with getting, as close of a relationship as we might otherwise have. And I don't think that's unreasonable. And that's why I feel like President Trump is maybe going too much the other way, saying, hey, yeah, whatever, we're just going to work with you in this kind of transactional sort of, what can we get out of you? And we don't really care about your human rights record.
Well, it's not like he attended a stoning or something like that.
No, fair enough.
No, I mean, I get that. Because in fairness, I am all over Democrats when they go to places like China or Cuba and don't mention human rights and treatment of dissidents and so forth. So I think it's a fair criticism. That said, it's within the context of shoring up the alliance, and yeah, I mean, I think maybe he could have done more, but I can live with how he handled it. And I guess moving on the next way, again, it's the next thing that I was going to mention is, again, something he didn't say or didn't explicitly say that he's been taking some heat for. And that is in Europe at the NATO memorial honoring Article 5. He did not explicitly state that the U.S. would honor Article 5 of the NATO charter, which says that attack on one is an attack on all.
Just real quickly before we get to that, one other thing I wanted to ask you about the Middle East and what he did there. Did you get the sense, and a lot of people mention this, that he sort of is essentially changing our strategy to a certain extent to say we're kind of going all in with the Sunnis in the region? And of course, Saudi Arabia and Egypt would be the two leading Sunni countries in this region, particularly the Saudis being much more religious, kind of against the Shias, which are led by Iran, which is, a pretty sizable country. And the other, do you think, pretty clearly, again, that the theme that I talked about being a change in policy to Obama, President Obama, his administration seemed to sort of decide that really we couldn't essentially stop Iran, and the thing to do was to talk with them to kind of bring them in a way and work with them. And the Trump administration seems to be really kind of going not entirely 180 on that, because they're not disowning the Iran nuclear agreement, at least not yet, but it's a pretty clear change in emphasis. I'm wondering if you agree and if you think that's a good idea.
No, yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think to some extent you could argue historically up until the Obama administration, our policy had always been favoring the Sunnis, because again, we had strong relationships with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, and through the 80s and 90s, and looked at them as our strong allies to contain Iran, and then to some extent Iraq, which was its own sort of different problem. So I think it's one of these situations where you have to pick a side. I don't think you can just straddle this and say, hey, we just want peace. So we just want everybody to get along, or try to balance one against the other, especially when you're dealing with the Iranians. I mean, you can one thing you can say for the Saudis is they're not expansionist in the sense that the Iranians are. Same thing with the Egyptians. Again, they may not treat their own people well. They may have do other things we don't like, but they're not threatening other countries in the region with attack. Now, okay, I suppose you could say, well, the Saudis are intervening in Yemen, but that's also a little different, because it's sort of a threat that hits home, and I think you could argue that's sort of self-defense. But no, I think sooner or later, your better policy is picking a side and saying this is who we're with, rather than trying to just do a little of each.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see what you're saying, but I also, I don't know that I entirely agree with the idea that you have to just black and white sort of pick a side. I mean, I'm going to sound here probably like Charlie Brown getting the football pulled away, by Lucy and so forth. But we see signs in Iran that moderates are, if not ascendant, at least making some gains, with, for instance, the recent election and so forth. And
again, but that's just there was some concern that I'm going to say it wrong, the recently elected Iranian premier, it was too moderate. I mean, this is a guy who's like too soft on Israel, which, and he's threatening to wipe them off the map with a nuclear bomb. So, if that's moderate,
you're right, of course. And it's a matter of degree, though. He's a lot more moderate than the guy that the conservative clerics were backing. So, baby steps kind of thing. But, and so I guess I see your point, but I also think that if we go too hard in one direction, we risk kind of just basically not taking advantage of what might be some small openings. So, but anyway, moving on, you mentioned the NATO visit and the whole Article 5 thing, which is that mutual defense clause, which was only invoked once, in fact, after 9/11. And there was a lot made of the fact that President Trump didn't just come out and say, yes, we still stick by this, although a number of people, including Secretary of State Tillerson, said that, and we do, of course, stand by this. So what did you make of that then?
I think that was a lot of, on the one hand, look, it'd be better if he did say that. But on the other hand, it's Trump really can't win for losing in some cases. And I think the media was going to find something to criticize. I mean, he was standing there at a Article 5 monument, sort of commemorating when the other nations came to America's aid after 9/11. I don't think there was any implication that we would somehow not honor our commitments, other than, look, he stepped up the language about other countries needing to pay their fair share. But I don't think you can necessarily say that he was saying pay up or we don't defend you anymore. And to sort of criticize him on something that he didn't explicitly say he's going to honor the treaty that has been in effect for 60 some years, at the memorial service for the specific article. I think that's going overboard, picking on the guy. And like you said, it's through other places in the administration, we've made clear, and he's made clear in other statements, that he would honor that the Article 5. So I think it was a whole lot of nothing, but it sort of shows that I think the media and the left were really looking to find something to take issue with.
Well, and I see your point, but I also think that it works both ways, and that there were administration officials who said this was a choice that was made not to explicitly state that, and to me that sounds a little bit like President Trump basically giving a little bit of a middle finger, just being difficult because he wants to be difficult and knowing it's going to cause a little bit of a kerfuffle, that sort of thing, because it's pretty clear that they knew that would happen and they decided to do that. But yeah, I think when push comes to shove, of course, we're going to honor our Article 5 commitment. Now, the thing about the 2%...
or let's put it this way. If we didn't, I mean, then what would the Europeans come and say? Well, come on, you said at the monument at that trip, you were going to do this. I mean, I think it's good to reassure and send the strong message to the Russians, but I don't think it's not legally binding, or to the extent any international agreement is legally binding.
Right. I mean, now on the other issue, that 2% funding goal, that's actually an issue where I agree with the president. I think it's entirely reasonable to say that, well, the NATO countries agreed to this goal as they did a few years back, then they should be willing to, honor that agreement. I don't think that's unreasonable or unfair. There's some people who are saying, well, why is he pushing back on this when there are so many other bigger issues? Well, if this isn't such a big deal, then why don't these other countries go ahead and do that? I think that would be an easy, simple thing that they could do to show that, okay, fair is fair, and we're going to honor our commitment, and we expect you, United States, to honor your commitment. And so I'm actually with the president on this one.
How about that?
Yeah, it's weird. It felt weird to say that. I mentioned that on the Facebook this week, and but there you go. Sometimes I think he's right, and in this case, I think he's right. So there you go.
Yeah, and so, some conservatives, for example, I know Charles Krauthammer has been sort of exercised about how the 2% really doesn't make a difference just because of the vast differences in the GNPs that we're talking about. That the contribution, I mean, our contribution still dwarfs everyone else's, with the exception of perhaps England and Germany. But no, I think it's important that we stick to the deals, and when we again, that's sort of part of a treaty too. If you're going to say, hey, we're going to stand by what we said, and we expect you to stand by what you said you do. So I agree. It's not a huge deal, but I think it's good to see a little pushback.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, of course, after that, then there was the G7 meeting, where I think the biggest thing that came out of that was the fact that 6 of the G7 countries strongly reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Climate Accord. One didn't. That, of course, would be the United States. But I think the news here is that the United States didn't uncommit to it. In fact, there's some indication from senior officials that the president's view on this is, as they love to say, evolving, and that we might not entirely pull out of this. And to me, obviously, as somebody who is a big fan of the Accord, I think that's a good thing. And I feel like it's I try to look for positive signs of growth with President Trump, signs that he's learning things. And I'd like to think that this is a sign where he's listened to some people who know a lot more about this and have a lot more experience than he does, and is saying, well, okay, maybe some of the crazy stuff I said in the campaign trail, I'm willing to put that aside and reconsider it, and, as the word has it, evolve. And so we'll see. But I at least I thought that was somewhat positive.
I suppose. I mean, my feelings on the Paris. I mean, it's very much sort of a symbolic more than any actual make actual effect on the environment. And I'd be hesitant to bind our hands, which it doesn't do. I mean, again, by saying nothing or even affirming it, as President Obama had. There's no binding force on the United States because it hasn't been ratified. So that's fine. If he makes you feel better by doing that, then I feel better too.
Well, he made me feel slightly better, so there you go. All right. Well, before we move on, we'd like to thank our new supporters this week. First is Sin, a new Patreon monthly sustaining supporter. And thank you, Sin. We really appreciate that. It matters a lot to us. Also,
Thank
Tim.
you.
Yeah, there's also Tim, who is another new Patreon supporter. It's a big week for our Patreon monthly supporters. And so thank both of you. We really do appreciate it. And finally, we have Ann from Monroe, Wisconsin, who contributed through PayPal. She sent a great email shortly after she contributed, in which she writes, "You've made me think and you've helped me to listen. In return, I sent you a donation, and although it's difficult for me to share on Facebook, I do email the link to your website to friends and family. Thank you for being my favorite, and I believe the best political podcast out there."
Oh, wow. Thank you, Ann.
Yeah.
That means a lot.
And if you'd like to help keep the show going, you can do what Sin, Tim, and Ann did this week. Go to politicsguys.com and click on either the Patreon or PayPal donation links you'll see there. And every donation helps, and we greatly appreciate it, no matter what the amount is. And those recurring monthly donations, which you can set up through Patreon, they are particularly helpful because they give us a better sense of what to expect financially as we move forward with the show. And of course, we would also really appreciate it if you could check out our sponsors using the promo code and spread the word by sharing episodes, new show tweets and posts, and leaving reviews and ratings of the shows on your podcast app. Okay, moving on. Well, Donald Trump submitted his first real budget blueprint this last week. And, as with almost every presidential budget, it was deemed dead on arrival in the House of Representatives. And with this budget, there was bipartisan rejection of many of the draconian cuts in discretionary spending that were outlined, along with a fair amount of derision, also somewhat bipartisan, for revenue projections that were generally seen as fantastical, I suppose you could say. Jay, what did you think about President Trump's first full-scale budget proposal?
I'm okay with it. Again, with the understanding that this is the way that Donald Trump operates. This is the way that congressional budgeting operates. It's a negotiation. So he's going to start from a position which he realizes is not going to be the position that he ends up with. But it makes a statement. We had talked about this a couple months back when we had sort of the preliminary outline of this budget. And there was a really good piece in the it was a Wall Street Journal editorial talking about Bob Kerrey, Democrat Bob Kerrey, who's since left Congress. But the idea that sooner or later, if we don't tackle entitlement reforms, there's just not going to be enough left for all the other things that liberals want to do. Even if you wanted to do all these wonderful liberal things, entitlements and the debt are eating up an increasing amount of our budget and increasingly cutting into what the discretionary funding is. And you and I have talked a bunch of times too. The discretionary funding is the very smaller piece of the pie compared to the rest of the budget. So, to me, I think it's good that we're sending that message that, look, either we're going to have to get serious with entitlements, which this budget, it does a little bit. It doesn't really offer reform. But if we don't, we're going to have to drastically change what we think of as what the government can do, or drastically rethink about how we can pay for it.
I agree with you in a lot of respects there, but probably my first reaction on seeing President Trump's budget was, I miss Bob Dole. Which maybe that needs a little explanation. It probably does. But Bob Dole was sort of...
Well, I miss Bob Dole, too.
Well, there you go. I mean, back when I was a Republican, you remember those days, Jay. Bob Dole was sort of... he was the kind of Republican that I could get behind. Jack Kemp was another guy like that. The old-fashioned sort of green eye shade, fiscally responsible Republicans. The sort of Republican who would look at a Donald Trump budget that assumed an average of 3% growth over 10 years and would just roll their eyes, especially when the CBO estimates 1.9%, the Federal Reserve estimates 1.6%. And sure.
Right. I didn't hit on the growth projection thing, but you're absolutely right there. I think I think that seems to be a pretty high target. I would say it's not impossible to reach 3% growth. We certainly did it throughout the 80s and 90s.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
But to just assume it consistently for 10 years, I think is unwise.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that because, exactly that's what some people are pointing to. They say, look at the 1990s, you got, many years of 4 to 5% growth even. But I'd point out that was a very different time. Number one, labor force productivity was a lot higher. And we have now this massive retirement of baby boomers. You combine that with a really extended period of slow productivity growth that has most economists just completely puzzled. But with those things combined, I mean, seriously, they call the paradox, the productivity paradox, and they say, well, why is productivity so slow? I don't know. Is pretty much the economic consensus there, and so, this to me is kind of a sign, and Nick Mulvaney, the budget director, said, well, anyone who says, that we can't get this kind of growth is down on America and isn't being enough of an optimist. Like, oh, that's a great way to spin it. But, Republicans didn't used to do this. It used to be Democrats were the big tax and spenders, and okay, Democrats still are the tax and spenders. But ever since Ronald Reagan, really, Republicans have been the tax cut and spenders, which I would say is even worse. No party is really concerned about fiscal discipline here, when at least there used to be some small part of the Republican Party, kind of exemplified by Bob Dole, I would say, that did care about this stuff. But now everyone just seems to be, whatever, we'll figure it out.
I would say there's still that part, and again, you might take issue because it would seem sort of odd to compare them with Bob Dole, who they would be, sort of consider them antithetical to what they believe in. But I mean, the Tea Party, Freedom Caucus folks, I mean, that's sort of what swept them into office, was the let's cut taxes, let's lower spending. So I think that's still out there. Although it is less, and I hate to use this word, nuanced than what you saw with a Senator Dole, or someone who was again, in essence, also a deal maker. He knew what he had to do to get something passed, and you knew you weren't going to get everything you wanted, and had sort of a better sense of how to manage these things responsibly and not just say, oh, we're wiping this out.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I hadn't thought explicitly of the Tea Party comparison, but you're right. And I think you're also very right on the main difference between the two is Bob Dole was no radical. Bob Dole, I think, believed in incrementalism, and he largely accepted that the sort of welfare state that had come up from the 30s on was pretty much a basic feature now, here to stay of our government, where the Tea Party,
we were, at least regardless, we weren't going to get rid of it in one session of Congress.
Exactly. So yeah. So I think that's a pretty important difference. But again, I guess my main point on it, I do miss Bob Dole. If there were more people like Bob Dole in Congress, I think we would be in a lot better position. That's for sure.
You recall who Bob Dole endorsed in the primary?
Bob Dole was, getting older and so forth.
All right.
And so, but anyway, moving on. This week, the Supreme.
I met Bob Dole once.
Did you?
Just throwing that out there.
I didn't
Brushes
know that.
With greatness.
Wow,
just as Trump
cool.
nodded to me one time, I shook hands with Bob Dole.
Well, that's really cool, actually. Well, okay. So let's move on and talk about the Supreme Court. This week, the court ruled that 2 congressional districts in North Carolina were drawn in violation of the Constitution due to lawmakers impermissibly relying on race as the key criteria. Now, in the 5-3 opinion, with Justice Gorsuch not participating, Justice Kagan, who wrote for the majority, rejected North Carolina's argument that using race as a proxy for party affiliation was constitutionally permissible. Now, in previous rulings, the court had and still does allow gerrymandering based on party. So the one thing I thought was really interesting about this ruling, Jay, was that Justice Thomas was part of the majority here, which is not something you would usually expect to see. And so I was wondering to get your thoughts on the ruling in general, and then also on Justice Thomas being in the majority on this case, which is very weird.
Yeah, I think this was kind of fascinating. And if you're a Republican, I think you look at this and it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. And we've talked numerous times about how one of the biggest problems with our country, with the rise in sort of extremism, and extremism isn't the right word because that calls to mind bombing things and so forth. But I guess, more partisanship is ultra partisanship.
Polarization, yeah.
And part of the problem is the way we have drawn our congressional districts. And part of that is a relation because having to steer between the sort of the Scylla and Charybdis here of the Voting Rights Act and constitutional provisions. On the one hand, the Voting Rights Act is instructed and sort of requires that you can't create districts that would prevent minorities from being elected. You would have these what are called majority minority districts, which essentially would guarantee or at least give a much greater possibility of electing a minority to that seat. But at the same time, courts are saying, well, but you can't draw districts so that you gain an upper hand in others. For example, essentially gerrymander all of a minority group into one district so that there's only one seat as opposed to making them competitive in two or three. And to me, that's Kagan came down on the side of, listen, race was the key factor here, and that's what was impermissible. But it sort of reads as if, look, if we can do this and it benefits Democrats on the one hand, then it's okay. If it that in that case, race could be used as a permissible factor. That said, if you looked at the map, this district is just absolutely goofy looking. It's really hard to justify from any geographic sort of standpoint, at least as best I can tell.
Yeah, and you're right. I wanted to point that out. Is it's gerrymandering is the kind of thing where it can be really difficult to define what's permissible and what's not. But there are some instances where just, like with pornography or other things, it when you see it, and you just look at some of these districts and say, oh, come on. Now, obviously, oh, come on can't be a constitutional standard, but you know what I'm saying here. It's pretty clear sometimes what's going on here, which is why I think in a number of jurisdictions, a number of states, they've tried to move toward a nonpartisan or some kind of a bipartisan districting commission as opposed to letting the state legislature handle it. And, one thing I disagree with Justice Thomas a lot, obviously. But one thing I admire about him is the guy sticks to his guns. He's consistent. And back in the 90s, he was against gerrymandering when it benefited Republicans. He's against it when it benefits Democrats. And so he's been very consistent on this. He hasn't been very political on this. And I salute him for that.
Well, me too. And I wanted to point out his concurrence, I think, is fascinating because it shows that he's playing the long game, as they say. He concurs largely on the basis that, look, if we're talking about race, this ought to be subject to strict scrutiny, as opposed to, in some cases, you could have an intermediate scrutiny with things if it's sort of meant to benefit a minority group. And he's sort of sticking to the guns that, look, it kind of as Justice Roberts said, the best way to stop discriminating by race is to stop discriminating by race. So I think that's good that he's again, like you said, he's being consistent and he's playing the long game. The dissent in this was interesting. There were two reasons for dissent. One, I think is just based on the prior case law. This district had essentially been upheld earlier by the Supreme Court with no problem, and so I think there was some sense of, well, we're not just going to keep doing this every time, and every time there's population changes, and also look, the new districting that was drawn in that was now found to be unconstitutional was the result of challenges to the prior district. So that's what I mean. It's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But Alito also pointed out that what makes this difficult is the high percentage of blacks who identify as Democrat. And it's really difficult then to draw these districts when you have one factor that is permissible, that is party affiliation, with one that is not permissible, or at least can't be used as the key factor, which is race. So I would throw out there, and this is something I wanted to get your thoughts on. Are we to the point now where this provision, this minority majority district requirement, I mean, has outlived its usefulness or become a barrier.
Yeah, I think that this was a great example of unintended consequences when this was first first became a big thing in the 1990s, and there were a number of these majority and minority districts that were created, and all of a sudden Democrats said, "Oh, wait a second. We're actually losing seats in Congress," and Republicans all of a sudden start saying, "Yeah, we kind of like this provision of the Voting Rights Act because it works out because we get more seats because of, as you pointed out, that whole idea of there being such a strong relationship between minority voters and the Democratic Party." And so I think it hasn't worked as Democrats had hoped it would work, certainly. But, in terms of outliving usefulness, I think that it's an interesting point because, all of this, this case, cases that are coming up in Virginia and Texas, all of this stems from the 5-4 decision a few years back in Shelby County versus Holder, right, in which the court basically did away with those so-called pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act, which
right. for certain states, right?
Which Justice Roberts, I believe, who wrote the majority opinion, said, these are no longer necessary. This sort of state level discrimination isn't going to happen. And then what happened? A bunch of these states rushed into it, in my view, not really discriminate based on race, I would argue, but I would argue discriminate based on party to try to gerrymander, which the court has said is okay. So,
yeah. Oh, and I absolutely believe this is partisan. I don't think it's racial. I think the idea that I guess that's sort of my point is look, is the racial piece of this just seems to be sort of coincident to the partisan piece.
I think I have a certain amount of sympathy for that. And of course, that's kind of an argument against my own particular interest, which is getting more Democrats into Congress. But I think there's something to be said for that. If the court has held, and it has held, that partisan gerrymandering is pretty much okay, and if that's really what's behind this, and race just happens to be connected to that in a way, correlated with that, well then, yeah, I kind of say that's probably okay. Now, there are going to be some people who are saying I am underestimating the amount of institutional racism in the South and these legislatures. And okay, maybe I am, because honestly, I'm from Ohio and I don't have any experience with Alabama or Mississippi or anything. So maybe that is the case. And maybe I don't know what I'm talking about because I don't have experience with those legislatures and those cultures. So I will just say that maybe you're right, but from where I sit, it seems to me much more based on trying to gain partisan advantage than trying to specifically disadvantage a minority. And so I'm kind of all over the place on this because my political interests kind of push against some of what I see as the Constitution here, and I'm trying to be faithful to both.
That's good. That shows growth. That's like Judge Gorsuch said. If you're going to be a good judge, you're going to decide cases in ways that you might not want to decide them.
That's kind of how I'm feeling a little bit on this. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, so let's move on to what we're reading this week, where this is the part of the show, of course, where we step back from the crazy pace of the news cycle and talk about, the kind of more in-depth, thoughtful things we're reading or listening to or watching. And this week, I'm going to recommend two things. The first is a podcast I've been listening to a lot lately, and it's the Daily Standard podcast. And this is put out by the Weekly Standard. It's pretty much every day. It's relatively short. It's to the point, and it really presents what I think is a clear and reasonable conservative viewpoint on whatever happens to be going on in the last day. It's become my single favorite source for conservative opinion. I mean, aside from you, Jay, of course.
Second favorite source.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, people are going to say, well, after everything I've said in the show today, what's happened to me? Am I turned into some kind of...
You've been listening to that. You're listening to that podcast.
But, Bill Kristol's on the show a lot, and there's some other folks on it who I really think they do a great job. And I've been making a real conscious effort to expose myself to a lot of conservative viewpoints to balance out the much more common liberal viewpoints I get, and I think it's been a good thing for me. And some people might say, well, you're moving too far to the center. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway,
you're just having an off week.
Maybe that's it. I don't know, but anyway, I think it's a really great podcast. One thing I will point out is we share a sponsor, Dollar Shave Club, and if you listen to their Dollar Shave Club ads, just remember that you can get the same great Dollar Shave Club deal by going to dollarshaveclub.com/TPG, and you really want to use our link because you get the same deal, and we're kind of we're not the super well-funded kind of media.
We're the scrappy underdogs.
Exactly. You want to support the scrappy underdog, but check them out. Also, I read a fascinating profile of Secretary of Defense James Mattis this week. I think Mattis is one of the best appointments Donald Trump has made. Reading this didn't do anything to change that view. If anything, it kind of deepened my respect for the man. He really seems to be just incredibly smart, thoughtful, and with just a super high degree of integrity. And I thought it was just a really fascinating profile. It raised a question for me. Some have raised the question of, well, why would such a great guy, such a well-respected guy, work for a guy like Donald Trump? People have raised the same thing about H.R. McMaster, his national security advisor. And I think it's a reasonable point, right? And some people said McMaster is sullying his reputation by working for Trump. It kind of reminds me of the same arguments that people made, well, more than a few years ago, about why would the Stoic philosopher Seneca go work for Nero? I'm not saying Trump is Nero exactly, but and I think the argument is, well, you think you have an opportunity to do some good, and try to bring a guy along who maybe doesn't know a lot and maybe make a change for the positive in an otherwise not so great situation. I'd like to think that's what Mattis saw. That's what he's trying to do. That's what McMaster saw. That's what he's trying to do. And so I don't see it so much as they're selling out. I see it as they're trying to make a mark, make a positive change under less than ideal circumstances. And I think there are a lot of Republicans of goodwill and high integrity who are trying to do the same thing in a Trump administration. So there you go.
I would agree with again Madison McMaster, and then that what their jobs entail. It's not so much partisan politics. It's defense of the country, and I think you can say, look, I can agree or disagree with Donald Trump, but getting this right is bigger than any domestic politics, and it's something we have to get right. So that's I agree. I'm glad they're there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jay, do you have anything this week that you're reading, listening, watching? I
do, and again, I hate to keep going back to this because I guess I didn't mention it last week, but Peggy Noonan had a piece in the Wall Street Journal this Saturday, which if anybody doesn't get the Saturday Wall Street Journal, again, I know it can be expensive, but it's so worth it. But it was a great sort of discussion on the book by historian David McCullough. And I'm a big one for, especially when we do these weekly, what are you reading, wrap up kind of things, looking at the big picture historically. And McCullough has recently put out a book, and I haven't read the book yet, but it's sort of a collection of his speeches that he's made sort of on the importance of history, why it matters, why it makes you a better person, why it makes us better citizens. And I think it was just really fascinating because so often we lose perspective, and we don't understand that when history happens, it's not, no one knows where it's going. These things happen in real time. And if you go back and view history here are a bunch of people who are human, who are sort of good, sort of bad, and they're all just kind of doing the best they can with the situation they've got. It's really fascinating, and McCullough brings that out, and Peggy Noonan, highlights what he said. So I would recommend that to anyone, and I think that's about it. I suppose I could go on, but that was my sort of favorite article of the week.
Sounds good. And of course, as always, we will have links to all these in the show notes on our site, politicsguys.com, if you want to check them out, which we hope you will. All right, moving on to listener mail. First, we want to thank listener Sewer Geek, yes, that's the name, I assume it's a pseudonym or whatever, who left the latest review of the show on iTunes, which reads, I think you guys offer a fair and balanced look at current politics across the whole spectrum of viewpoints. Being somewhat of a novice in understanding politics and history, I appreciate your objective discussions. I find them to be a relief from today's hyper-sensational news media. So thank you very much, Sewer Geek. Yeah. Next is Alex from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who has a question for you, Jay.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
This is never good.
No, Alex has, and this was a few weeks back, he asked, why do you seem to not want a special prosecutor? Wouldn't anyone valuing our American experiment want to see an independent commission tell us that there isn't a concern, even if the possibility is remote? I just would like you both to recognize that the outrage that a good portion of the country feels about Comey's firing is not based out of a trivial political narrative. So, Jay, I'll let you start on this.
I would say, and for the same reasons I raised earlier, we have institutions that protect against this sort of thing. I mean, the founders built this in when we have a bicameral legislature and we have a court system. And there are investigations going on in both the House and the Senate, and they're going to get to the bottom of this. And this is a situation where it's a little unusual in that Republicans are not simply apologists or trying to sweep stuff under the rug for Trump. I mean, at least I haven't seen that. I mean, I think many of these folks have been pretty vocal in their criticism of how he's handled these things. And I think the problem you get when you get a special counsel, special prosecutor, and we had talked about the differences, the varying degrees of these things a couple weeks ago, is you have someone who is, yes, independent, but also accountable to no one. And that's the problem, is you can have someone who will make their sort of fame or fortune on this, case and has unlimited resources. And it's not necessarily healthy, I think, to just turn over this much power to one completely unelected person when you have elected branches that are capable of conducting the same sort of investigations. Now, the way it would usually work, again, Congress can't prosecute anyone. They can make recommendations, though, certainly if they uncover something. Likewise, Congress can't prosecute the president. The only thing they could do would be to impeach him. And for that same reason, it's sort of, that's the Constitution is written in such a way that the check on a president who's acting badly is the House to impeach him. And I think when we add these additional processes and you could look. I mean, again, sometimes it's whose ox is getting gored. I mean, people made these same arguments about Ken Starr back in the 90s.
Yeah, and go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I would say, the one thing that's different, and it's a very important thing that's different from the 90s, is that we no longer have the independent counsel. That statute ran out in 99. It wasn't renewed.
Right.
And so
it's less troublesome now.
Yeah, these people aren't accountable to no one. They don't have, unlimited, and so that they can be fired. And actually, I believe in certain instances, like this instance, where you can reasonably question the impartiality. That I think this is the case where Rod Rosenstein made the right choice, made the right call, and I think that Bob Mueller's widely respected, and so I am for this, and I certainly don't downplay the outrage that people feel, or at least the concern that people feel about this, and so I think this is a good thing, and I look forward to the report. Though that's, of course, this is a very involved investigation, and in the past these sort of investigations have taken sometimes not just months but years, so this could be a long-term sort of thing. So there you go. All right.
Well, and I'm against the decision in the first place, but if you're going to appoint someone, I think Bob Mueller was an excellent choice to appoint. So I think he's going to bring a lot of integrity. And again, that's someone who has bipartisan respect, and I think will help bring closure to this sooner or later.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next is listener Nuno, who says, I write to you after listening to episode 100 and the obsession with the threat that isn't. Trump is interesting, but not the real threat. Meanwhile, Manchester got bombed, Ariana Grande gig of all targets. Are you obsessed? Are you so obsessed with Trump that you are forgetting the real danger? Now, I thought that was an interesting question. And, in a way, I wanted to bring this up because that's why at the beginning of the show, we wanted to raise that issue saying, to what extent do we talk about the scandal stuff, because it certainly, sometimes it can seem like news, but I think there's a danger to fall into covering what is the most sensationalistic. And so, Nuno, I actually agree to a certain extent on that first part of the question is yeah, we can, and much of the mainstream media, I think, focuses too much on that kind of sexy, sensationalistic stuff and doesn't cover the more substantive policy stuff. So I agree on that. Now, as to the second part of it, the Manchester bombing and so forth, well, I agree that that's hugely important, but that's a little bit outside of our scope, because our focus, of course, is American politics and policy. And so when terrorist actions happen that have a more direct effect in the United States, we absolutely do focus on that. But this is not something that's, at all trivial or unimportant, but it's just kind of outside of what our kind of our ambit is to cover. So, Jay, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I would say we don't necessarily. I mean, I think you're exactly right on the Trump stuff. I mean, part of it is, we started this out as a policy podcast, and then sort of Trump happened, and we sort of realized at the beginning of this year, it was sort of like drinking from the fire hose with new Trump stuff every day, all the time. And in fairness, look, he's the president, so to the extent we cover American politics, we got to cover Trump. But there was so much, and there was so often, it seems like so much about so little, that again, we've tried to back off that, because otherwise it does just consume you, that because Trump is going to keep doing goofy stuff. And again, I say that as a Republican every week, but no, we absolutely take terrorism and Islamic extremism seriously. And we've had some pretty good discussions on that. And I think maybe we'll have more as we talk about things like immigration and what happens on our counterterror policy stuff. But the other problem with covering things like Manchester is look, we do a once weekly show, and it's difficult to in those kind of situations, we don't know what we don't know, and obviously when we don't have information, we hate to just sort of speculate as to what happened and why it happened. And as things play out, then I think we can have a good discussion about what to do about terrorism and Islamic extremism.
And I think another point is we don't really want to stray outside of our areas of experience and expertise, because then we're just two guys who are talking, essentially. Whereas when we deal with American politics and policy, that's what our background is, that's what our training is, and that's the stuff where we feel like we can offer something more than just two guys talking. So yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of listener mail, we've been getting a lot of listener mail about various things related to healthcare. We're not ignoring you. What we're going to do is we want to hold off on that until the Senate comes up with some sort of a bill, which is going to happen at some point, we presume, and that might actually be worthy of an entire special Politics Guys episode. It's certainly a possibility, but we just want to try to handle all that at once. And so if you're interested in that,
not dodging you.
No, we're not dodging you. So there you go. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or random thought you want to share, you know where to reach us, mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page where you can message us and where we post throughout the week is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. We really appreciate all of you great listeners who've generously supported the show. And if you'd like to be one of those supporters, you can do that through the Patreon or PayPal links on our website, politicsguys.com. And if money's tight or you're already a financial supporter, we hope you'll consider hitting the share icon on your podcast app to pass the episode along to people, and leaving ratings and reviews of the show on your app. Sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets also helps to spread the word. That helps to bring in new listeners. That leads to more donations and advertisers, all the stuff that helps us to keep the show going week after week after week. And speaking of that, going week after week after week, well, we will be back with a new interview this Wednesday and our weekly analysis of the news on Sunday. We hope you'll join us.